Like I'm going live.
Okay, nice.
Like I'm going live.
Okay, nice.
Like I'm going live.
Okay, nice.
I think I'm having trouble here. So do you see my screen?
No. It says it started, but it's just black.
Do you see the slides?
No.
Just a black screen.
What about now?
Yes.
Good. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session on vaccines for all at MIT. I'm Ramesh Raskar, professor here at MIT. And today we're going to talk about the MIT SafePaths protocol for vaccination. And this is a protocol that's being worked with in coordination with our friends at IDEO, with James Smalls and Lezinskaya at Brown University, Vitor Pamplona at PathCheck Foundation, Abhishek Singh, also at MIT, and Sanjay Sharma, professor at MIT. And just to give you an idea of what we mean by vaccination cards, these could be paper cards with verifiable credentials on them that would allow encrypted user journeys and data-rich vaccine monitoring. And it's not just for whether you're vaccinated or not, but it's for a full user journey of phased eligibility, 2-dose visits, reporting of side effects and adverse reactions, as well as credentials and passports. And if you think about 1947 vaccination in New York, we were able to vaccinate 5 million people in 2 weeks. And one could argue that we will be able to do it because there was no need for digital technology, and there was no need to record PII and this very invasive kind of notion of recording every encounter. So can we create an experience that's as simple as folks lining up to get jabbed, at the same time have a very digitally rich view of what's going on? So we would like to kind of attack these 4 main challenges in vaccination: eligibility, dosing, health passports, and monitoring of and effectiveness and safety, and work alongside some of the state and federal systems for vaccination. So these are some really nice designs by IDEO, and we are working these designs and incorporating the right level of cryptography, the QR codes, the compressions, and so on. And you're going to hear a lot about how these codes can be used as an eligibility coupon or a ticket, for dosing and badges, for entry, for using status as health passports, and how do we also upload adverse side effects to state and federal agencies that are monitoring post-dosing behavior. And the idea with paper cards is that the individual, the user, the consumer, is just carrying a paper card throughout their user journey, but then other folks, as they encounter this individual, whether you are at an employer who's giving a tickets, or you are a community leader whose job is to go and knock on the doors and make sure people are getting vaccinated. That's the first column. You could give these coupons or tickets. At the vaccination site, the vaccinators would use an app to scan it, or when you want to use it as a health passport to get into a restaurant or on a bus, they can very quickly check your status. And caregivers can also use an app to upload any adverse reactions. So again, the top row is where the user, the consumer, has an experience that's very low touch, does not need to navigate complicated websites or call centers that can put them on long waits. So it's a seamless experience. But at the bottom, we have a app for rest of the health ecosystem to create a data-rich trajectory of the journey of this user. And so today you'll hear about some of the experts on the MIT SafePaths and PathCheck and University of Alabama team that are looking at many aspects of this issue. Kind of the cryptographic protocols and what are the schemas and what the software could look like, as well as some of the philosophies behind what it means to decouple scheduling and registration from the actual experience, whether we should use the date of birth and PII or not, how can we provide record linkage and all those things. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our expert panel of Tony Rose and Justin Dorsey to share with us some of the details of these paper credentials.
Thank you, Ramesh. It's a privilege and an honor to work with you and be here today to present the paper credentials. Let me just share my screen. So today we're going to walk through taking the paper credential design that has been developed and the implementation reference specification that has been put in place and just released yesterday. I'm Tony Rose. I'm working with PathCheck on the product team, and I'm the founder of Proof Market. We've built a verifiable credential online app called MedCreds, and I was a co-founder of the COVID Credentials Initiative and working with the Vaccine Credential Group as well. We have Justin Dorsey from New Context, who has been helping develop the actual technical specifications for the paper credentials. And he's been super helpful and has a lot of experience with looking at how do you take online credentials and move them into various modes, working with us and putting this into the paper journey with the PathCheck cards has been a unique opportunity and experience. We're bringing Chris Hale from Countable to talk about the practical applications in the markets where Countable has been delivering rapid diagnostic testing and medical care in East Africa for the past 5 years. So he'll give us a practical user journey and some practical on-the-ground experience for how this really solves some needs. I'll start with a little overview of the PathCheck integrated suite. The PathCheck suite, including the cards, also comes with real-time dashboards. The paper cards we're going to cover today. The paper cards can also be integrated into mobile apps for online use cases, as well as mobile apps that are offline and offline. The web dashboards for issuing and managing the credentials and the private keys, as well as the VeriScan app for vaccinators. When someone comes in with one of the tickets or coupons for vaccination, they would scan that and do the procedure, as well as issue to the person the badge, which is their information about the vaccination they received. And then the check-in app for businesses so that people can have their vaccination status checked and get onto the airplane or go into the concert, for example. Some of the challenges with getting vaccines in everyone's arms are eligibility. Right now, most people have no idea when they're going to get vaccinated. We view this card as a way to do a vaccine journey. And so it's not just the end result of the credential, it's you get a coupon or a ticket that lets you know you're in the line, you have your turn, and you can use that coupon or ticket to register, check your eligibility, and get in the queue. So this really alleviates a lot of the anxiety that's in the world today. The second phase is dosing. And so there's a lot of challenges around managing the workflows. How do you know which site to go to? And how do you verify the person that is next in line is the person that needs to have the vaccination? Finally, there's the record itself. So it's recorded, it's updated to IIS systems. How do you get that information to the person easily and quickly so they have that proof? And then the last step would be the monitoring. So Once someone's had a vaccine, we need to make sure that they can upload any kind of adverse reactions or other feedback that they may have. So this really is about a patient journey. There's a number of ways that the PathCheck solution is looking at each of these steps. The coupon would make the person eligible for SMS whatever app-based registration. That goes into the scheduling step, finally administration and monitoring. So as we go through the vaccination process over the next period of time, there's gonna be a number of different challenges that will arise. Right now we're in a situation where it's all about getting the vaccine that's needed to places, and there's more demand than there is supply. As time goes on, we'll reverse that, and then we'll need to find out how to get the long tail and make sure that people are getting in the queue that they need to be reached. And with some of these coupons, this helps to reach those vulnerable populations. Coordinating the second dose and getting transparent and equitable vaccinations into the populations. Another important aspect is how do you know what's going on? So with users and citizens having an engaged way to interact, this can now be tracked down to the vaccination sites and zip code levels. So this really is about adherence to the vaccination program and giving the people a way to track that and be involved in that process. And it's also digital divide crossing. So it gives people that don't have a cell phone or wouldn't want to do that through the cell phone a way to do it on paper, and as well as the digital journey on the app. The cards themselves go through this journey. So the step one is to distribute the coupons. They go through the scheduling, they do the 2-dose visits, and then they can report their health status as well as have the proof of their vaccination at the end of that journey. Really the key benefits of this process is this helps to reduce the burden on public health. This empowers individuals and citizens to take an active role in the vaccination journey, alleviating anxiety. And with this data that's part of their interactions with the various touch points, predictive analytics and real-time insights into the program can be gained by public health. These are the cards that can be distributed. This is one design that's possible. We can provide, and if you look at the GitHub there, you can download the artwork, and also there's the specification that Justin Dossi will be covering here in detail as to how each of the different QR codes is created, what data is on the QR codes, and how this is put into practice in real life. It's a really simple journey from the citizen perspective. They receive a coupon or a ticket, and they use that code to register and get their schedule. Once they go to the vaccination site, they receive a badge showing them what it was that the vaccine they received. And finally, they can report the side effects. So while there's a lot of behind the scenes work with scheduling and administration, from the user perspective, this is a way to give everyone a similar common experience and a similar common vernacular for that journey of getting everyone vaccinated. Here's an example of the SMS interface that is one of the modules that's available for requesting the coupon or ticket and using that to schedule an appointment, and then getting reminders that your appointment is coming up, as well as receiving the badge once you've received your vaccination. And here's the screenshots of the app experience. And Vitor is going to go through really nice demos of these, but you can see that the app experience gives a bit more of a UI that someone might expect. Oops. And here's the app for the administrator. So when the person arrives to get vaccinated, the administrator would scan that person's QR code, whether it's on the paper or whether it's on their phone. And this would allow the administrator to send to the person who got vaccinated after the vaccination event the badge that shows that event and helps them track their status in the process. This walks through the workflow from the perspective of the vaccine administrator. They would first make sure the person that is next in the queue is eligible and perform that process by scanning the QR code. Once they administer the vaccine, they would issue to the person the badge, and the record keeping would happen on the back end. At the second dose, the same process happens of verifying the individual, making sure that they're getting the right second shot, and then finally giving that verification of the process completion, which is the person's verifiable credential for their vaccination status. And here's an example of some tools that can be used on the business side for requesting personal health information, vaccination status, the user consenting to share that information, and that organization having proof that their facility or their population has been compliant with whatever policies they have in place for entry, whether that's having concerts or air travel and such. And Sue will talk about this and give some examples. This is one view of the Vaccination Dashboard, so that public health can see how is the overall vaccination program going, where is the demand coming from, and where might they need to react to the real-time situation on the ground. Finally, these can all be delivered as modules, so we can help you with the paper vaccination cards, mobile app integration of the vaccination cards and patient journey, as well as the SMS. There's the scanner app for the vaccine administrators, verification app for businesses, and the vaccine management dashboard. And with that, I'll hand it over to Justin to go through the technical specifications and some of the design decisions that were made in the implementation of the paper cards. Justin, would you like to share your own screen?
Yes, I think it'll go easier if I do.
Okay.
Stand by. Okay, you should see the paper cards. Moving along. So here's the problem. 38% of the world's population doesn't have a smartphone. That's a lot of people, and we need to reach everybody with vaccinations. 3.7 billion people don't even have internet access, so we can't assume that they can open a page or something on the internet, something like that. Vaccines need to go to everyone. Everyone needs to have access to credentials, and so we fall back from online to offline, and we hand out paper credentials that can support people who don't have internet access or don't have fancy feature phones. This was the design that we started with when we developed the specification. There were a lot of questions that came up in this. Designs typically aren't technical specifications, so that's no big surprise. So our challenge was to turn this into something that can be implemented by programmers and can be used by everybody. There are a lot of challenges that we dealt with in order to develop the specification. It's a big list here. At a high level, what we're talking about is the smaller the QR code that we can generate, and we used QR codes because they're widely available, accessible in a variety of programming environments. But the less data that we can put into these, the more the privacy of the individuals is protected, and the more accessible the QR codes are to a variety of hardware, and that's on the scanning, verification, as well as the issuing side.
Justin,
we also
your screen stopped forwarding. We're at the 38%.
Oh, that's interesting. Thank you. That's odd. I'm going to stop sharing and reshare. Can you see the vaccine credentials need to work for everyone?
Not yet.
Okay. Technical difficulties? This is how it works, right? Let's share one more time. All right, are you able to see now?
We are not, but if you'd like, I can share my screen and see if that helps.
Sure.
Unless you have another, want to try something different.
That's odd. I share all the time. Of course, it's going to stop working this time. Will you go ahead and share in presenter mode, Tony?
Sure. Is that coming through?
It comes through fine. Thanks for the help.
No problem.
Okay, so let's go ahead and proceed. Here's my 3.7 billion.
Yep.
Let's back up to the design. Slide 23, please. Okay, this is what I was talking about when I said this is the design we were working from. You may have seen this image before, and our challenge was to turn this into a technical specification that programmers could implement in a variety of circumstances. Slide 24. These were the challenges that I was just discussing. We need to cram as little data as possible into our payload, but also have it be sufficient to support the vaccination journey. And the specification that was presented in the design was very helpful in coming to this. We also wanted to support as many different programming environments, so all kinds of devices from physical embedded IoT type scanners to receipt printers to fancy smartphones. They all need to work, and that means that the specification that we came up with is compatible not only with the latest modern languages, but also environments as old as COBOL. Next slide. So we were targeting representing this payload as either a JSON data structure or a more compact URI type data structure, building on open standards in order to ease implementation and remove questions about encoding and that sort of thing. A 69 by 69 QR code is, in my opinion, pretty large, but it's still much, much smaller than the ones that we see other places. And so this will support lower resolution cameras and lower resolution scanning devices to bring this QR to be accessible in more places. We also standardized the format for the badge payloads, again, to ease implementation and speed distribution. Next slide. So we came up with some solutions that should make this distributable in a global situation. For example, we used Unicode UTF-8 encoding for local names so that the people with names that don't fit into the US ASCII character set are able to have their names accurately represented in the identity containing badge information. We used the widely supported, secure, and relatively small ECDSA encryption algorithm. There are encryption algorithms out there that can be used for signing and hashing that produce shorter signatures than this, but the trade-off is that they're not as well supported across the board in a variety of environments, and that works against our goal of ease of distribution. We decided not to do a full encryption layer on the data set inside the QR. This, again, improves accessibility of the data sets, and it reduces the data set the output size, potentially. While with signatures, we can still protect against tampering and forgery and have strong capabilities such as key revocation in the event of data breaches. And we built this on existing open standards to make sure that if somebody needs to implement this, they can do it quickly and it will be correct. The outcome was pretty exciting. A data envelope around 300 bytes is dramatically lower than we've seen with any of the other vaccine credentialing standards out there so far. And we're working on getting that even smaller, making some smart decisions about how to do that. Next slide. So here's an example of a coupon. This is the payload of a QR code that tells you when you can have your QR code. I'm sorry, when you can have your vaccination. And you see it contains information that reflects which cohort you would be in a prioritized vaccine distribution mechanism. And it also has a standardized structure where there's a type, a version, a data, and a signature section on the JSON data structure, which makes it easier to parse from a programmer's perspective. The badge that Tony was talking about earlier is the payload that contains the information about which doses you have received. In this case, you'll see that Jane Doe who's referenced by a cryptographic hash, has received 2 Pfizer doses with the lot numbers 13A056 and 29A063. And so this person has completed the full course of the Pfizer vaccination. Moving on. We had to make some decisions in order to make this available, accessible, and easy to distribute in a very short time frame. In all offline scenarios, it's impossible to invalidate a QR code as soon as it is scanned. That means that we're stuck requiring reuse of the QR codes. And we didn't love that trade-off, but it was the right decision to make to support distribution of vaccination to everyone. Also, when you're offline, there's no way to check online against people's identity. So they'll have to have some sort of government issued ID to correlate with the card they have, just to make it absolutely clear that the person holding the vaccination card is the correct person. And this means that if verifiers collude and they collect information, they might be able to trace the process of a badge being used. If the card is lost or stolen, it can be really hard to reissue a card. And so there may be some requirement for linking to a database of issuance to allow for easy reprinting of cards. And preserving privacy has trade-offs around usability. It can be necessary to scan multiple QR codes to establish somebody's identity in a trustworthy way. And there are a few other trade-offs that we dealt with in order to implement this specification. Next slide. But we had some great success in implementing the specification. We found that this can be done. This can be done in an accessible way. And accessibility supports distribution, which supports adhesion or adherence to the vaccination program. And the smaller the data, the less likely it is that we'll leak highly sensitive information about an individual. And the more hardware can print these QR codes and scan these QR codes. Building on open standards, this itself also being open to contribution from anyone in the world, means that we're going to make something that is great and is easy to implement. Next slide. We have a lot of work left to do. We're working on a new revision of the specification in situations where identity information should be incorporated in order to improve usability and accessibility. And we're also building acceptance test suites and reference implementations, demo applications. We're looking at optimizing the output to reduce the data set size, which will improve the QR code output. And we're also implementing a public key database distribution framework so that signatures are easy to validate. And we're talking about how more advanced online identity and health wallet cases can integrate with the contents of the printed badge. Next slide. We're open to involvement. We've gotten contribution from a variety of people all over the world, and the more people can weigh in and look at this specification and contribute their ideas and work with us, the better. That's it for me. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Justin. Let's hand it over to Chris Hale. He's going to talk about the user journey and how this is important for some of the work he has a lot of practical experience with. And with that, Chris, let me hand it over to you, and I'll advance the slide for you.
Thanks, Tony. In working with Tony and Justin as they developed this solution in coordination with MIT and PathCheck, there were a number of lessons learned in combating other global pandemics, and a lot of insight around the solution moving from purely online to serving an offline solution. And so we at Countable have been working on supply chains for pandemics like tuberculosis, HIV, malaria, and syphilis into emerging economies, primarily in East Africa. And this is the journey of those rapid diagnostics tests, as an example, through what is called the long tail of supply chain. And that long tail of supply chain is a big part of the opportunity and the solution that's been presented here. One of the things that I think is unique to identify is there is a very real level of adoption of mobile applications consuming QR codes on paper. And you can see on the screen an example of those QR codes on the top right-hand side of a purchase order from the Ministry of Health in Rwanda. And what that allows for is to tie a delivery all the way back up to the manufacturer's batch, through the lot delivered, and then down distributed to the end consumer, and now through this solution directly to the patient. And the importance of a solution like this on global health in this context is, we have an allocation challenge to solve for, especially when you think of low and middle income countries who need support to compete for vaccines. And this applies very much to low and middle income communities here in the United States as well, is there are donor groups who are stepping in to ensure that those communities receive that allocation. And the solution presented today allows those groups to track the impacts of their interventions and ensure that the right populations are receiving the vaccination as a result of these programs. And the decision by this group to incorporate a very inclusive solution and think deeply about the use of paper and the online offline capabilities and payloads and readily adopted standards is a huge step in the right direction to make sure that vaccines are available for all and widely consumable, and that outcomes are clearly demonstrated. And so this has been work that we've been doing for years, and super excited to see the thinking and the progress that's been made around this solution. What ends up happening, and if you want to go to the next slide there, Tony, is you are able to deliver very real analytics around lots and the number of vaccines distributed, and to some extent the specific patient populations that received them. And these are traditionally the types of analytics and dashboards that one would expect to see in a distribution program for other capabilities. And I think the PathCheck solution has gone to a level that we can bring this level of insight and analytics to a part of the population, and to delivering the level of broad spread distribution that it requires to make sure that this vaccination program works globally. And what ultimately ends up happening is, some of the markets that have adopted these capabilities already are leapfrogging in a way those markets where the capabilities might already be established. And so working with a consortium like this group, we can share those learnings across different markets and begin to implement them and into a solution like this one. And so really happy to see this organization and this group thinking about how to make this as broadly accessible as possible, given our experience in global health and East Africa. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Chris, very much for that insights. There's the email addresses in case you'd like to reach out to Chris, Justin, or myself. With that, I'll hand the call back over to Ramesh. Thank you, Ramesh.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Chris. That's a wonderful overview of how paper-based credentials can be deployed worldwide. With that, I'm going to introduce Vitor Pamplona, who's the CTO for vaccination efforts at PathCheck Foundation, to show us how the healthcare workers and vaccination sites and verifiers can use an app to interface with these paper credentials. Vitor Pamplona.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me again. Let me start by showing how the actual cards look like. And these are simple stickers that you can unglue from this paper and then attach to your actual paper card from, like you have seen with Tony in that beautiful design. In order to print one of these, the only thing you need is a printer like this. It's a simple label maker that you can buy for $50 or so. And it's small enough that you can carry anywhere, which makes the entire solution extremely portable and very scalable because the same printer, instead of connecting requiring connection to a Wi-Fi or a Wi-Fi network or a computer directly, it can connect straight to a person's phone via Bluetooth. So this makes it, you can be in a place that you don't even have internet connectivity, you don't even have a Wi-Fi router anywhere to connect the two devices together, and which makes it, extremely scalable. So I'm going to start by showing how the same QR codes we have can be used together with an application. And you should be seeing now my mobile phone. And as you can see, I have a little app there for the PathCheck Foundation. It will just load. And here you can see, if you have seen this app before, this is a very similar app to what we usually do for exposure notifications. And it follows the same style. So these features can be added into those types of apps that you see out there as well. What we want to do is the first step on the app side is to submit a coupon ID. This coupon you'll be receiving from the state or from a central authority that will indicate if you are eligible to participate in one of the phases, right? This can be either a QR code sent to the mail, say by the federal government to all the folks that receive the stimulus checks, for instance, or through an SMS system or through an email system as well. So I'm going to go through the screens here. It's a simple procedure that it tells what the user is doing, and you just need to insert the code either manually or by scanning that QR that you have seen before. The app will load that information for you. And we'll try to, if you are eligible already for the vaccination, we'll try to make an appointment right away with the nearby location. And as you can see on screen, it's trying a date already without me having to input what day and time I prefer to have this vaccination. The idea here is to remove all the constraints in the process such that the process becomes so easy that anyone can just slide through it and get their appointment and make sure there is a position for them, even if it's months away from today's date, right? This coupon will be used to manage your entire cycle. So from here, you can, for instance, when you get to the location to be vaccinated, you can just click record vaccination. And here I'm going to assign the QR code in the same way you have seen before. And it will give me a card for in this case, a Moderna's vaccine, in this demo for CVS, and also another coupon for the next dose. Given that I took one today, it calculates the date difference and tries to make an appointment already for me a few days away. And the same app, and just to emphasize that the same app is just a digital version of the paper card, you can click on the card and you get the exact same QR code it was printed for you. So if you need the solution as a backup, for instance, you can print this one and it will work in the same way as the one you receive from the Vaccinator. And of course, you can use this card as well to get into any location, either through the app or through the through your paper cards. Let me show you how, in order to print and send these cards, what we offer is a solution that allows that helps states or cities or local neighborhoods or pharmacies to simply manage their primary keys, their keys that are used to sign the codes that are going to be out there. And these keys can be stored on a server or on an app. Let me show you the first version that is server side. And let me see if we can do this. And so I should be able to see my browser here. This is a demo account for a manager of this vaccination programs, right? You can have many of them in many locations with many different dose types and brand names being associated with each one of these programs. This very simple system stores the private key, your passwords, and your public keys in order to verify that the QR code is valid. So just to give you an example, for instance, if you click show code on this portal, you will see that the portal will compute a simple QR code where if people will scan this code, they will be taken to this other screen where they can generate their own, there you go, their own version of their badge. Let me put my name in here, and here I go. So in this case, even if I don't have a coupon, even if I don't have the entry point that we would usually see in the field, the vaccinator managers and the staff can still generate a coupon for you. And the same coupon that can be used here can be printed and actually put on the location as one of these little stands in order to facilitate the generation of new QR codes. And in this case, actually, the patient or the user can actually do the generation of the code himself. He can actually scan with his phone and go into the same screen, write his name, and get his own copy of the QR code. Remember that all the information is on the code itself. So, and because it's signed, there is no way to change that information without having to change the signature. In order to change the signature, you need to know the password of the manager or the vaccinator. And lastly, what I would like to show is our Vaccinator app, which is a similar system that I just showed, but instead of being on the web, is on an app. And the goal here is to make sure vaccinators have an easy way to print the QR codes. So they have to log in the same way I did on the web, choose a location that they are today or one of the programs you are doing. They scan the bottle to read the lot number and brand and product name from that vaccine. Simply confirm. And now you already did your first step with just acquiring information to put into the QR codes themselves. When people come in, you can click record those. You will read the patient's coupon or badge. If they are bringing in whatever they're bringing in, you can read it here. And by scanning, you know exactly what is the phase that this person is supposed to be into. You can check with their IGs or with their with the employer, for instance, but ideally you can see on the screen and you can activate the coupon right here. By activating, you block anyone else from using the same coupon. And once you do it, you just administer the dose, make sure all the procedures are followed in that location the way you want. And here's the magic. You can just now click print badge, and the system will take you to an options screen that you can choose between the badge itself, where it contains the health information of that certificate. This includes the manufacturer, the brand, the dose size, the routes, and how you perform these procedures, as well as the vaccinator's brand name, like a city of Somerville or somebody that is responsible for this program. The same vaccinator can choose to print a status card, which is essentially the same type of idea of the badge, but without any health information. So when the user starts or decides to show the status, he's just not presenting any health information, as opposed to presenting the badge, which will show exactly what types of procedures he went through. And the passkey is just another QR code that will have his name, phone number, or contact information in there. If they don't have one, you can print it right there. But if you already ship them with a coupon, for instance, you would not need to print it again. By just selecting one, it connects straight to the printer, and then you can move on to the next person in the line. And as you can probably see here on the Vaccinator app, we also don't really have a lot of fields to insert information into. You just confirm the bottle number, confirm the coupon, and if everything goes right, you're not typing on the phone as well, which means that everything here is very efficient to make sure the technology doesn't interfere with the progress of the vaccination procedures themselves. And I think this is all for today. I'm going to revert it back to Ramesh.
Thank you, Vitor. That's just a fascinating way of thinking about vaccination journeys. And the analogy would be more like Uber, because these experiences are extremely consumer-centric, and we shouldn't be thinking of the visit to a vaccination site as a medical appointment, but more as a consumer experience. And the trade-off between consumer experience and digitization of data is very important. And if you use the analogy with Uber, the way you schedule your ride is very seamless by either using an app or something that you have pre-registered. When you get to your vaccination site, which is in your taxi, there is no additional work the driver or the passenger has to do. They can walk in and walk out. And when the ride is finished, it's very easy for them to get a receipt of how much it was charged and so on. And the driver doesn't have to do any extra work to give you that receipt. It just shows up in your app. So I hope we can create a very similar experience with the vaccination cards, the Boost 19 app, as well as the scanning app, so that the experience is more like booking a ride and traveling in Uber, as opposed to what we have to do today, which is experiences on disconnected websites and long waits for call center calls. So with that, let me invite Professor Sue Feldman from University of Alabama, and she's going to share with us the notion of air traffic control. How are we going to get a bird's eye view of what's going on in this ecosystem? So Professor Sue Feldman from University of Alabama, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ramesh. As Ramesh said, my name is Sue Feldman. I'm a professor at University of Alabama at Birmingham and director of graduate programs in health informatics. And so today, I'm pleased to give you a tour of our worldwide vaccination dashboard that has been made possible through a partnership between PathCheck Foundation and UAB. And so I'm going to put the address of the dashboard in the chat, and I'm also going to share my screen so that you can see the dashboard as I walk through it. So I'm going to walk through some of this in a moment. First, I'll give you an overview, and hopefully everyone can see my screen. So this dashboard provides an interactive COVID-19 vaccine dashboard, and it will allow researchers and public health officials to answer important questions, including trends for the future. So some of the data are normally constrained by fragmented landscapes of local systems and data collection processes. And users can access aggregated vaccination data and visualize information by state, region, and country. So what you see on the screen right now, this is our first iteration. We are currently working to optimize the data. It will include predictive analytics around things such as herd immunity, and based on supply, how long it will take to get populations in a certain area vaccinated, and vaccinations and positive case trends. So we're working on all of that. We should have a revised dashboard out on Monday. So just to give you a little tour of what you're looking at here, this is a worldwide map. This is a US map, and you can hover over each state and find some information. So I'm going to look at West Virginia for a moment and focus on that, because there's a lot that can be told from just by hovering over, over a state. So when we think about herd immunity, which is what a lot of people are asking about, right? When will we achieve herd immunity? Herd immunity is disease specific. So we don't really know what herd immunity will be for COVID-19, but we're assuming somewhere between 50 and 70%. By definition, herd immunity is the prevalence of disease plus vaccinations. So that's what equals herd immunity in the truest sense. But there's a lot that we don't know about COVID-19. So we don't know if you've had COVID-19, how long does that immunity actually last? And so because of that, here we can look at the percentage of those in a state who have received the second dose, which we could use as a proxy toward herd immunity. So looking at West Virginia and then looking here at Alaska, those are the two states that have achieved the most or the greatest second doses and approaching herd immunity. A lot of people have heard about California giving 3.2 million doses and things like that. A lot of doses. Now it's up to almost 4 million first doses. But if you look at their progress toward herd immunity, just considering vaccinations, right? So we're not considering previous disease prevalence. They're really only at just over 2% for herd immunity. So there's a lot of information in this map. Then we can look down here and look at the top 10 states of vaccination by percentage across the population. And if we wanted to, we could look at only those who've gotten the first dose relative to the doses available. And you just click on these and we can just look at those. When you click on them, it turns them off. And so we can look at just those who have gotten first dose. So we see Alaska is pretty far ahead. If we want to look at those who have gotten second dose, so this would be the progress toward herd immunity, as I mentioned, again, Alaska and West Virginia come up. And so that's what that map is. If we want to look at the top 10 states by vaccinations administered, just like, who's giving the most vaccines. So we can just look at just total administered, that's all. And again, as I mentioned, California gets way up there. If we want to look at who's administered first dose, and then we can look at who's administered the most second dose. Now moving down, so this next graph talks a little bit about or approaches understanding supply and demand. And so that was the notion behind this. It's a little bit, takes up a lot of real estate because of states like California and Texas, because they have so much need, so many not vaccinated and so few available doses relative to those who have been vaccinated. So when we go back to California and we look there, we see that there's a pretty big gap between the available doses and the population to be vaccinated, left to be vaccinated yet. When we go down to West Virginia, the state that I cited earlier, we look at that they have almost about 47,000, a little bit more than 47,000 available doses, and they only have a little bit more than 1.5 million people left to vaccinate. So smaller states, smaller problems. Then we have two tables side by side. One is a US version and one is a country version. And there's a lot that can be done here. You can look, you can sort however you want to sort, and you can look at a variety of things there. You can, so there's a lot that can be done there in terms of sorting. You can then compare two states. So let's say if I want to compare Alabama, where I am located, and I want to include California, which is where I'm from, well, I could compare those two. Now, there's really no comparison, but I could look at the percent vaccinated if I wanted to. I could look at anything, but there's filters that can be applied to both of these. And then the last graph that we have here is vaccinations administered by country. So this is on a country level. And this is a rolling 15 days. And it's only those who have administered 2 million doses or more. And so again, this is the same usability that I mentioned earlier, is that you can unclick, or you can click on countries to not have them show up in the chart here. And so if you wanted to compare a couple that are more comparable, right, and you wanted to get rid of these lower ones, which become a little bit difficult to see, well, then you could unclick them. And so here you see how it immediately adjusts the scale a little bit. And you can compare, so here I'm comparing the US and China, and I can roll over the date, and I get some data by date there. So there's some questions that we've been asked about this, and so some of those questions I'm going to try and answer. One is, where do we get our data? And so if you click on info at the very bottom, these are our sources. It's all government data. And so you see that that's where we are getting our information from, is just all government sources. And then let me go back here. And then there have been other questions around how often are the data updated. So the data are updated every 4 hours, but that does not mean that we get data from all of the sources every 4 hours. And so if a source updates their data daily at, let's say, 6 a.m., and we do our update at 2 a.m. or 2:30 a.m., we may not get that data for another 4 hours afterwards. And so there can be some discrepancy between the data that are on our vaccination dashboard and as compared to the state or country level data, just because of when the data are reported. The other question that we get asked is, why are there spikes in data? And so there are spikes in data because some states don't do their reporting on the weekend. And we saw this with the COVID numbers as well. Like, why are there these big spikes on Monday and Tuesday? Well, because they're not reporting on the weekend. And so that may or may not be an issue with the vaccination dashboard as well. A lot of it just depends on when they're reporting. One thing that we are sensitive to, and others are very interested about are the racial and ethnic numbers in terms of vaccinations. These are just starting to be reported by the states, even though it's required information when people get vaccinated to collect that information. It's not always being reported. And so if we don't have access to the data, it becomes very difficult for us to show it. But we're showing the data that we have access to. And so we're super excited about this. This is truly a team effort. There are a lot of people behind the scenes working on this. And through our partnership with PathCheck, we are grateful for the people who are working behind the scenes to make this happen. And we invite comments, ways that we can improve it, ways that we can look for different data sources and include different data. And so I think with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Ramesh for the rest of the program. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Feldman. It's just fascinating to see how this dashboard, which can effectively become an air traffic control for the whole country and maybe the whole world, would allow us to not only understand a snapshot of how things look right now, but would, make the unrecognized gaps visible, as you said, about equity and reaching low-income populations visible. And again, using the analogy of Uber, I mean, Uber makes, its traffic data available to cities, and that allows cities to plan their transportation systems as well. So I hope the combination of the paper credentials, the scanner app and the dashboard will give us this air traffic control view. So let me welcome Tim Rowe, who's the founder and CEO of Cambridge Innovation Center here in Boston. And Tim has been a pioneer in many concepts, all the way from co-working spaces to thinking about new models of starting companies, stimulating a lot of the work in biology and pharma work here in the Cambridge Innovation Ecosystem, and more recently about a whole new initiative on CIC Health. So Tim, welcome, and tell us a little bit more about what you're thinking and what is CIC Health, and you're working in the vaccination space.
Thank you very much, Ramesh. I'm very pleased to be here and honored to be invited. So Ramesh did, I think, a nice job just with a quick background on who we are. Many of you may be familiar with Cambridge Innovation Center, which has been around for a couple decades here and has been focused on operating infrastructure for innovators. Early in the pandemic, we decided to introduce testing capabilities so that the many companies, I think we had a couple dozen companies doing pandemic response work based in our facilities and using our labs and so forth. So we thought, gee, we should do testing. And we worked with the Broad Institute to operationalize that. Then others started coming to us and saying, hey, could you do this for my kid's school? And so on and so forth. So we're now, I think we're serving close to 500 schools. We were asked by most of the major hospital groups in town to kind of do their employee testing. We do that for a bunch of businesses and so forth. And then, and I think we now have something like 30 public testing sites from Vermont down to Connecticut that are typically state-backed and free. When vaccines came along, the state was looking for folks to help organize the large mass vac sites. We realized that what we were doing in testing was actually very similar, taking over a very large space and having, thousands of people come through it and performing some sort of medical task. And we raised our hand and said, hey, we think we can help with this. They said, sure. And somewhat to our surprise, we're now operating the mass vac sites at Gillette Stadium, Fenway Park, the Reggie Lewis Center, and we have more coming. I think this morning we released something like 35,000 new slots for vaccination. And by the way, if you're looking for your vaccination now, you may have noticed the state changed the rules a little bit. If there is a 75-plus-year-old who needs assistance, you can bring them in for their vaccination and you can get yours as well, which I thought was a brilliant strategy on this part of the state because it'll do a good job getting more of our 75-plus folks supported while also solving the transportation issues and some of the other challenges that have blocked some of our older community members from getting vaccines. Ramesh asked me to share a little bit about what this experience has been like, and I'd love to just pause for a second and ask a little bit, what would be most helpful to hear about. There's a lot of different elements of doing this, from software, and Ramesh and I work with Vinay Gudwane, who has been leading the charge on our side, trying to make the state-provided software actually work, which has been challenging. We did not choose that software, and we don't have a lot of control over it, but we're trying to make it work, through to kind of crowd control and all sorts of other issues that we've been facing. What's of greatest interest?
Yeah, that's great, Tim. Thanks for that introductory comments. And it's really heartening to see how, kind of innovation ecosystems, like fortunately we have here in Cambridge, and kind of, the capital that you're able to bring for it, take over something. I'm guessing a year ago, you probably didn't think that you'll be running a stadium, 2 stadiums actually. So kind of just help us think through how you made that happen and what were the kind of challenges. That's kind of the first part. And then we'll come back to the second part, which is more relevant to this audience, which is what was some digital innovation in the last mile.
Okay, so some big picture kind of reflections that maybe are more about organizations and how they work and how does that lead us to being able to do this. One of the reflections I've had is that when you have a big new task to take on, like doing the vaccination program for the state of Massachusetts, for instance, it helps if you have a large organization that is sort of underutilized. Building an organization from scratch, hiring people to do things takes time. Norming with that group, learning what people are good at and how to operate together, that takes a lot of time. We had an organization of 350 people that suddenly essentially lost its mission because people weren't going into the office as much. And so we had a large staff that just sort of had time on their hands, and we were able to do something else with that. I built a lot of businesses before. I've never had an experience that went this quickly. And I credit a lot of it to that. We were just in a unique position of being a large, capable organization that suddenly didn't have a mission. And so if I were trying to do something in an emergency context in the future, I would look for other organizations like that, if that makes sense. That kind of they've got their stuff together, but they're not busy. Whereas the hospitals, for instance, have been incredibly busy with the COVID itself. Responding to that, plus keeping their regular businesses going. They didn't have fleets of people with extra time. And so somebody might say, well, why isn't it like Mass General Hospital running, the Gillette site? In fact, they are involved. They are the medical directors for it. But the reality is that's one person they were able to send to just kind of overlook everything. And they even weren't sure if they had the capacity to do that. Just to put it in perspective. So the existing overloaded institutions, asking them to take on a new mission doesn't really work. Whereas if you take a sort of an underloaded institution, then it does. That was the first, I think, observation. A second observation was that in these times of crisis, leaders need to make decisions very quickly about who to use. They don't bid. These are no bid contracts. They're just somebody senior is saying, look, I trust XYZ person, let's go. In our case, that wasn't us, that wasn't me. I tied up with Atul Gawande, who many of you probably know, an author, a physician, he's a writer for the New Yorker, but he was also on the Biden COVID transition committee. Dr. Gawande has those trust relationships across the state as a healthcare leader. And so he co-founded CIC Health with me. He actually made the phone calls and people said, yep, go for it. Anything that you're involved with, Dr. Gawande, we're good with. And it was his judgment that we, the rest of the CIC Health team, had the wherewithal to actually execute. And so it's interesting to see how the kind of trust relationship cascades are what determine really who's gonna do these things, or who is tapped or given the opportunity to pursue these sorts of things. And with Dr. Gawande, I didn't know him before the pandemic, but we worked together for probably 5-6 months before vaccines came along doing testing. And so it was in the testing work we did where he developed the confidence that the CIC Health team, really the former CIC team plus a few additions, were competent at doing this well. And of course we weren't in the early days. We made all kinds of mistakes like anyone else would, but I think what he saw was that we were quick studies and we kind of figured things out. And that was the same with vaccines. Early on, we had days with long lines out there in the snow. We were baffled because every single person had an appointment for a time and we knew that we had the capacity to process it. And then when you think about it, it's like, oh, so people are going to think that they should come an hour early. And if they come an hour early, that means there's an hour-long line because they can't do it until their actual appointment. And it just sort of dawned on us. It's like, if we told people not to come early, then of course there would have been no line. But we had to adjust a little bit so that people doing their normal behavior would lead to a system that also worked well. And little details like that, they were a lot of fun to sort of figure out and just to think about. Not in any way insurmountable, but it does take some hiccups to kind of figure out how this all should work.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. I think the story for PathCheck Foundation is also very similar. And this point you're making that we should repurpose, underutilized organizations, I think it's an important one. I mean, we talk to many state leaders and state CIOs. So I think it's a message worth repeating, which is instead of going after traditional public health or health institutions, they might want to look at organizations that are kind of finding their new new role given these disruptions and empower them to do this. In a way, PathCheck Foundation, which is spin off from MIT, also had the same thing. Even if somebody had given us $20 million to hire this team, we would not be able to hire people like Vinay Gidwani and Adam Berry and Sam Zimmerman, who lead PathCheck Foundation. So that's an example of that. Let's talk about a little bit about your data. I mean, one request from this community of innovators is you're refining your own process, kind of on the behavioral science point of view about what you just mentioned, which is, hey, how long should we tell people to come early? What happens at the site? Tell us a little bit more about that. And also, can we request you to make that data available? So maybe Boston is doing well, but other sites, other countries could start learning from that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two pieces there. It was an interesting situation where the state had already selected a software platform for the whole state's vaccination effort. The only exceptions were private institutions that there was like MIT was designated as a private vaccination site, so they could kind of do their own thing. But for all the sites that more normal people could go to, they were on the same platform. And that platform was indeed very weak in a lot of ways. I should just say it was simplistic is perhaps the best way to put it, and not especially road tested in the real world with the kinds of challenges that would face it, and certainly the scaling and so forth. I do think that they're working hard to make improvements, and we're expecting the software situation to change a lot in the next few weeks. So I don't want to overly dwell on that, but sometimes you're going to drop into a situation where you have an imperfect kind of systems and data infrastructure environment. And now I'm talking about kind of the actual data, like the flow of appointments and all of those sorts of things. There's the metadata, I suppose, which is the kind of numbers of people. It's really probably better described as know-how at this point than data in terms of how to operate these sites to avoid the pitfalls one or another. There are lots of little things, like for instance, first responders could do second appointments for vaccines quite quickly. And so we had staffed the second appointments function very lightly. When we got to 75-plus-year-olds, it completely changed. And in booking a second appointment took as much time as it took to give them a vaccine. And they often didn't know what their schedule was, or weren't quite sure how to figure out what it might be, or who to talk to, or when could they get there. They may be in a congregate care facility. So there are all kinds of interesting complexities with that, the booking of the second appointment. You would think that was the less complicated part of this process. It actually turned out to be the most complicated part of the process for the 75+-year-olds. And then, of course, you can think of lots of ways to simplify that or change the structure, re-engineer to be easier. My favorite one is that normally when you take a trip, you book both your outbound and your return. And so you know when you're flying back from Mexico, right? And why don't we do that? We were just booking the outbound. You'd get to Mexico and they say, gee, when do you want to go back? And that, that was a design flaw in essence. You could say in the software or in the system. And we may be able to fix that. We may not, because as you know, once these systems get going, it's very hard to change them. For instance, you have to book those second appointments at a time that we don't yet have appointments open, right? So because we're, all right, so why don't we have the appointments open? Well, if we opened all the appointments out in the future now, people would book them out and there would be no slots available for second appointments. So we only open appointments a week or so at a time, meaning that our schedule is, at least in principle, open beyond that. But then we needed to give you somehow private access to the second appointment booking capabilities, because we couldn't open that up to just anyone signing on and so forth. So these aren't, again, nothing about this is insurmountable. These are very straightforward kinds of problems to address. But it often seems that until you're actually living it, and you're seeing the issues like, gee, how hard is it really for a 75+-year-old to book a second appointment? You can default to something which at first blush feels okay. Like, well, after their first appointment, they'll walk over to the desk and they'll book their second appointment, done, right? I don't have to think about that, you think, right? And so the fact that their caregivers were not necessarily with them was an issue. That's changing now. And we helped encourage the state to say, hey, it would really help if the caregivers of the 75+-year-olds could go with them. And if that's happening, look, they're already going through this whole process. We're already dragging them through this facility. We really ought to just give them their vaccine because they're going to need it eventually anyway. And by the way, if you do that, and as mentioned, this is now policy in Massachusetts, you have this wonderful thing where every 75-year-old is getting calls from everyone they know saying, hey, can I bring you for a vaccine? Which really addresses the sort of there may be dementia at play, transportation issues, all kinds of issues that make it harder for the elderly to get access to vaccines. This really neatly addressed that, while creating an opportunity for a certain amount of abuse, where you call your perfectly functional 75-year-old neighbor and you take them in for their vaccine and you get yours. And on the scale of things, that was an acceptable sort of quasi misuse, if you will.
Yeah.
And because it did convince the neighbor who might have been dragging their feet to go, in fact, get their vaccine. And if you look at the epidemiology, we know that the actual deaths are vastly disproportionately in that age group. So if we can really do a good job getting that age group vaccinated, and soon after the 65-year-olds, we're a second or a fifth or whatever wave we're in now, another big wave, fueled by new strains, will just have a much less deleterious effect on society. So all of this, Ramesh, is, as I said, you can't call it anything else other than know-how, and it's being created as we speak. We haven't had a chance to write it down, right? And we're not even sure yet some of the solutions we have for some of the problems. We're just trying them for the first time now. We're not yet even sure if they're the right solutions. So we're sort of a step away from successfully, kind of being able to ship that to others. But we're just bringing someone on board, a senior person whose job will be to figure out how to do that knowledge sharing. And so we're close to a place where I think we can do that. We're also, trading notes with people all over with how they're doing it and trying to learn from others' approaches. In fact, the whole idea of doing it at Gillette Stadium came from an article in the Times about how the UK is approaching this, converting stadiums. And you think that's an obvious thing, but New York decided not to do that. They said, we're not going to do the stadiums. We don't need that. And they were wrong. And now they're reassessing that. And they're saying, oh, well, actually, maybe we should have done that. And so all of this is kind of blind leading blind, people trying things all over the world simultaneously. And some things just end up turning out to work. And that's great. And some things don't. And there's usually a lot of political blame for every single thing that you might possibly have gotten wrong along the process.
That's fascinating. So on that note, thinking horizontally and also thinking vertically, how are you able to coordinate or share notes or with other sites, either in Massachusetts or elsewhere, like Dodger Stadium or the stadiums in Charlotte and so on? And what are some things that are emerging from that? And the second question within that is, what about going vertical? Are you also expected to also help smaller sites that may not be stadium scale, but maybe they're at universities or kind of large employer centers and so on?
Yeah, these are all the questions we're thinking about internally. As you imagine, if you're in our management team, you would ask the same question and we'd be debating them. We know the Dodgers. Actually, our investor also owns the Dodgers, and we've been talking with them for months. We have found that in this sort of pandemic disaster response type of environment, that one of the really key competencies, if that's the right word, or resources that you need as a responder is close relationships with the regulatory authorities that oversee that location. It turns out that that the things you need from the public sector are pretty extensive and impact how you're going to do things. Let me give you some examples. We needed the public sector to allow EMTs to do vaccination. Without that, we wouldn't have had enough people available readily to actually do the vaccinations. That was a policy change, and the Department of Public Health had to make a decision that EMTs were allowed to give these injections. Normally, they are allowed to do it in an emergency situation. They're trained for it, but they're not allowed to do it as in the normal course of medical care. And this had to be essentially treated as an emergency situation under the law. Another situation is if you deem that you need to have a licensed physician supervising those people in order to deliver this kind of healthcare, which under normal healthcare rules, you need to have someone who is able to practice care independently, like a physician at the top of your hierarchy of your delivery people. You certainly can do it. It roughly triples the cost of the medical care. Because the organizations that do that, the medically led organizations that deliver healthcare, charge very differently than medical staffing companies. You wouldn't know this unless you had tried to go out and hire a lot of EMTs. And you discover that there are two different ways you can hire and the price points are completely different. Well, the state wasn't all that interested in paying that higher price point, as you can imagine, because they're buying care for every single person in the state. That's a very expensive thing to do. And anything they could do to manage that cost was important to them. In order to solve that, we needed the state to be the physician of record for the delivery of these vaccines. That was a new concept for this state. And please don't write this stuff down or tweet it if that's all right. I don't know how much of this is public. Can I have that? I'm going to tell me if you don't agree with that premise, or any of you journalists or something.
Not on this call, but this recording is
I realize I'm sharing a little bit of sort of inside baseball here. I just don't know how much of it is, in the public record. But
this is being recorded live, so being broadcast live. So just
it is being all right. Well, all right. Sorry if I've shared a confidence. In any case, the fact that they've done that is public, but the fact that we had to go through the thinking of that was sort of unique, if you will, to how Massachusetts approached this problem. And I think it was done exactly right. We ended up in the right place, and everybody's on board with it. But if you go to the next state over, you don't necessarily have that in place. And that may require an act of a legislature or a governor's involvement or some other thing. So I guess what I'm saying is that the tight coordination with public health authorities turns out to be critical. And so we realized that we were more likely to be able to have big impact if we did more sites in fewer states. So instead of doing sort of the Dodger Stadium and the Gillette Stadium, but not Fenway, it made more sense to do Fenway and Gillette and not Dodger Stadium, if that makes a simple version of that.
Yeah.
And I gave you one example, but there are probably 10 examples of why that's driven that way. You also have really important conversation to have about equity and access. And those conversations tend to be very locally driven. What neighborhoods are underserved? Where are the hotspots? What's the accessibility to the places that you chose as your mass vac sites? How do you fix that? Once you do move into neighborhoods that had potentially been historically underserved, What kinds of engagements do you need to have in those neighborhoods and with which community leaders in order to have that be successful? It's not enough to open a mass vax site in a historically underserved neighborhood if people aren't going to show up because they don't trust you. And so what are the building blocks that you need to have in place in order for you don't run into a situation which we've had both in New York and Boston, where the mass vax sites in minority neighborhoods were principally patronized by richer white folks from outside the neighborhood. How do we right that ship? That's a very local conversation. It has to be very sensitive to the way things work in the given place that you're in. So in the end, in a way, I think we emerged as Massachusetts' answer to delivering mass vax, or one of the people doing that. And we might be able to do that well in some other states, but it's not something that you can easily transfer knowledge into everywhere at once.
Yeah. That's just fascinating. I mean, I can only imagine, I think running this mass vaccination site is probably, as important as, the people creating vaccines, because, it's a mission, right? For each of these folks. Let's shift a little bit to a kind of a blue sky kind of brainstorming mode for a bit. If we had to kind of redesign many of the solutions, in the earlier part of today's presentation, we talked about, in New York in 1947, we were able to vaccinate 5 million people in 2 weeks, arguably because, of course, there are cold chain issues and a few other issues, but probably the main reason is because we didn't have to worry about digital tracking. People lined up and got jabbed.
We didn't do that, and we didn't probably worry a lot about liabilities. So you just said, here's some vaccine, go door to door and inject everybody. And we could do that here in this country, but I think we've evolved to such a different place that we're not comfortable with that kind of delivery. But where are you going with this? Are you saying sort of, is there some blue sky other solution that we could envision?
Yeah, we were earlier in the presentation, we are using the analogy with Uber, a completely seamless experience to do this. And one could imagine there's an app, of course, but you could also imagine, there's just new forms of, vaccination cards, right? That have just QR code stickers that are given out as either a voucher for vaccination or a ticket, which has actually your name on it. And then people can line up, and those unique codes can be used for liability, for reporting side effects, and also for making, follow-up appointments and so on. Effectively, a new social security number, that's more secure. It's digitally verified. It's like a Ticketmaster ticket.
I love this, and I think it's possible. It's very possible, and we actually saw something very analogous in testing recently. So most of the testing we've done about 1 million COVID tests at this point in CSE Health, have been PCR individual diagnostic tests, which required a doctor's order and a lot of paperwork. Recently the FDA said, or you can do pooled tests where you have 10 people in a tube, and because you're not giving an actual individual diagnostic result, we're not going to consider this diagnostic. So you don't need a doctor's order anymore. You don't need to report to the state the test that you did. Oh, by the way, you actually don't need any protected health information anymore because it's not diagnostic. And the whole process rapidly collapsed from something very complicated and administratively time-consuming into something that was super simple. And to their credit, the state then adopted this and has offered this very simple solution to all teachers and students in the entire state and public schools. So all 1 million or so people can now get free testing once a week, paid for by the state, using this vastly simpler approach, which is literally 10 times cheaper. That's not a figure of speech. And so yes, it is possible that you can scale, and it inherently scaled testing, because now you have 10 swabs in one tube. That took as much lab resource as one swab did before to test. Same amount of lab resource. So you actually increase tenfold your lab capacity and cut by 10 your cost. And as a result, you were able to do something that no other state has done, which is to offer free testing for everybody in public schools once a week. Yeah. And so yes, it is totally possible. We're doing this right now in other sort of arenas. In the vaccine area, these elements, the sort of the rules around it, everything is strictly controlled by the state, just as testing is by the FDA. And so as people, were people to invent here's a better way to do it kind of approach, particularly as you have new vaccines that don't have quite as stringent temperature control requirements and maybe just a single dose, I think some of these new solutions become more viable. When you had the 2-dose model, you had requirements to do, minus 30 or minus 80 degrees Celsius storage, and everything would go bad if you didn't maintain that strictly. It led you to a heavier, kind of more controlled model. And the requirement to get someone to come back meant that you had to have a lot of data in the system, as you can imagine. I think with these new vaccines, different temperature requirements, you could imagine a wholly different delivery model. And that would be something that would be interesting for people to work on. The target for that, once pitched, I think I would start with someone like Vinay in-house to sort of just say, hey, does he think this could actually work given his understanding of how the system works? But then it would be ultimately to the states to say, okay, we have a solution, a really pretty interesting solution that they might want to consider. Yeah, and Vinay was here 2 weeks ago on this platform, kind of, sharing some kind of, grand challenges for innovators to start thinking about. So coming back to this, get the computers out of it, get the PHI out of it. I actually don't need your PHI. I don't know why. I mean, I'm not that worried about people asking for more vaccines than like 3 vaccines. Like really, I mean, maybe that's an issue. If it were, we can I don't know, tattoo everyone that they got it. But I think it's brilliant. By the way, there's a question here from Vitor. I'm not sure if you're looking at the chat, but we might want to just go ahead. So Vitor says, are there any thoughts on site size and the amount of people coming together in a single location? Are there diminishing returns / curve by site size? Is there an upper limit to doing centralized vaccination programs? So I'm sure there's an upper limit, but in practice, what we're finding is that it's the stadium capacity that's the limit. Meaning, if we could do a site that could do 100,000 people a day, we probably would. The Gillette Stadium gets 68,000 people to every football game, and they arrive within a 2-hour window. So their capacity at that stadium, if it was just sitting in a seat in the stadium, is probably a couple 100,000 people a day. The way we do vaccination delivery, with the fact, remember that you have to have someone be observed. This is another piece of the process which is important. It's a 15-minute wait if they haven't had any prior issues with allergenic reaction. It's a 30-minute wait if they have. And so just figuring out how you're going to have everyone there wait, socially distanced, because by definition they don't have their vaccine yet. So we don't want them to get COVID from each other while they're waiting. That ends up taking a large amount of space, right? We space people out, I think, 10 feet apart from each other in the waiting area. And it has to go at a certain speed because they have to wait there physically. It's like a production process where there's a 15 or 30-minute step in the process, right? If you can handle if you solve for all of those things, then stadiums actually work out to be a pretty good place to do it. We're thrilled with them, and we think that you just kind of want to max out what you can get out of the stadium. We think that we probably can get to 10,000 people a day at Gillette, for instance. That would be 300,000 people a month. If you have, 5 sites at that size, that's 1.5 million people a month. If that's half of your overall vaccine effort, that's 3 million a month, and that means you get everybody in Massachusetts vaccinated in 2 months, right? that when you do all that math, you say, okay, so 5 big stadiums, that would really be great. And you can complement that with 500 little places, pharmacies and things, and they will help people who have special needs, who can't travel, who, whatever, that overlapping of the max sites and the small local sites, I think actually is turning out to be a pretty good model for reaching everybody. Yeah. And what if, on that note, what if we flip it? Again, we're brainstorming here. If we flip it and, the same way you would send a stimulus check to somebody with, low income, if you use that as a proxy for essential workers, can we just mail out these vouchers and tickets right now and just assign them a time slot? Because instead of treating this as a medical appointment, saying,
vaccination is important enough, we're just going to give you a date, March 17th, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m.,
Right.
and just show up.
Oh, that's actually
and-
an idea. And I think I like the creativity here. I think probably some of the reality is that you might run into would be that there is such a plethora of different places you can get your appointment that, for instance, people working in healthcare environments are often getting it from their hospital. Okay, they don't need to go in. You know, people in congregate care are often getting it in congregate care. Okay, they don't need to go in. And so the mass sites are sort of for the everybody else crowd. It might be hard to isolate that in the data. That's one piece. And then you have some significant fraction of people who don't want a vaccine yet, which is crazy in my mind, but it's true. And so you then might end up sort of holding appointments for people who actually aren't going to show in significant numbers. So anyway, but I think you're thinking along the right lines.
What's your take on this need to update, somewhat antiquated immunization information systems, the IIS system statewide? And they were set up for kids going to school mainly, and now the expectation is that the whole state will be in this registry. And when we talk to some of the state leaders, they're saying, oh, what we're going to do is set up a whole new registry, and we expect everyone in the state to go right now and register themselves in this registry, although we know who's in the state. So we're going to get millions of people to go back to the website and register them. What do you think about this mindset of let's collect a lot of data first, and then we'll provide them some services?
Well,
or that you have to update this.
I think you already heard, we're very excited about the approach to pool testing that requires no protected health information. I think that this is very amenable to sort of rethinking what do we really need to know. It's sort of like all the forms you've ever signed in your life that ask your gender. I have a child who's transgender, and they're not on the forms, but when you start thinking about it, instead of adding, non-binary to the form, why do you even have gender on the form? Why do we care? Right? I mean, maybe if there's a discrimination that you're trying to track or something like that, I could get it. But for a lot of these medical forms, I don't care what gender you are. I'm going to give you your vaccine. So I think in the same way, just rethinking what do we really need to know here. In practice, as I understand it, we're not really validating that you are Ramesh Raskar when you get there. Like, we don't have time to do that. So why are we even bothering? I think those are interesting questions. There are a couple of points here in the chat. Just so, Professor Feldman, I see you mentioning that private IHE, is that health? What does IHE stand for? I probably should know this.
Sorry, Institutes of Higher Education. So that's what we did in Alabama. That's what we're doing in Alabama is we're doing the route of sentinel testing. So you mentioned testing everybody once a week.
Yeah.
We're going the route of sentinel testing, and it seems to be going really well. We had when all this first started, we had where we were. Everyone had to come in with a test, right? So everybody had to be tested negative before they step foot on campus.
Right.
We had to present that. But now we've gone the way of sentinel testing across the entire state for all institutes of higher ed, public and private, and faculty and students. And
so by sentinel, does that mean you're picking a percentage of the people and testing them every so often? That's
right, 2 to 5%.
Okay.
Right, which is accepted as best practices in population health.
Yeah, so I would say that the fact that you're doing that is terrific. It gives you the infrastructure. If you had a bigger outbreak, you could always change the percentages and the frequencies and things to accord with what is currently happening in the pandemic. I think, and it's great that you're doing it with pooled. And my guess is the way you're doing it, if you're using pooled, it's really not a very expensive process. And that's bright. That's smart.
Yeah, it's actually been great. We also, we combine it with other things as well. We have daily symptom monitoring, and then of course we have the exposure notification app. So it's one of the tools in our tool chest. It's not the only one, but we have several tools that are used across all schools. So our daily symptom monitoring is public, private, K-12, and IHEs all across the entire state.
At the end of the day, I think it's just a question of what's working given the exposures that you have, and what your teachers and others will accept. And it sounds like you've got it. I see, Victor, you're asking, are we essentially, what kind of company are we CIC Health is actually, we're set up originally as sort of a standard company, but we're in the process of filing as what's called a public benefit organization, which is it's not a nonprofit, it's a for-profit, but it is not required to maximize its profitability. We're a mission-driven organization, but we're at least in theory, if we make profit, then that's okay too.
Yeah.
And thank you for your comment.
If you can, so yeah. So Tim, I want to kind of build on Professor Feldman's some of her questions, which is, so by the way, PathCheck Foundation delivered the exposure notification app for the state of Alabama, and Professor Feldman is one of our partners, and they're innovating, greatly. In fact, the dashboard is an example of how Alabama is helping the whole nation kind of think about, kind of a air traffic control view. But if you were to kind of put on your thinking cap again, and let's say we want to distribute to people an Uber-like app, that helps them, to their whole vaccination journey, allows them to pre-register, allows them to get scheduled, gives them last-minute guidance, saying don't show up an hour before your appointment. But actually your appointment was 2:30, but actually it's going to be more like 2:45. Right. Automatically gets them, second dose, and maybe from a liability point of view, even while you're at the site, says, hey, start your timer for 15 minutes and
right.
show the observer that you have crossed your 15-minute,
right.
15-minute, window. And later on, of course, you go home, you can still click a button and upload your side effects or adverse reaction. Anyway, those are some of the things we're thinking about. But I want to kind of hear from you. If you had to create like a dream app that everybody could use, what would you have in there?
I think actually, I really like where you're going in the first place. No technology, something involving paper, something super simple, more like the New York vaccine rollout. I would say, and then if I abstract from that, I would say the main goal here is how do you get throughput up, particularly for people who may not be digitally aware. Like starting the timer on your app sounds like a good idea for you and I, but you'd be surprised at how many people are like, you're asking me to do what? So you need something which is sort of just simple and easy. It almost would be like maybe what you want is I have one of these little cheap Boggle hourglasses or something like that. Maybe you hand these out. It's so think through your process to make it sort of really quick and easy. Or maybe there's something chemical on the form, like you scratch and sniff, and then when the color changes from red to green, you're good. Something like that. Or when you can smell the roses, you're done. So I would say, think about what could simplify things, and then also understand that, medical systems are slow to change. So if, sort of completely rewriting the rules about what kind of oversight is required or who can do it or whatever, it doesn't always work.
Yeah. No, I think that the image that's going to stay in my head is that hourglass. That's the level of thinking we need, as simple as possible. Something that costs 10 or 20 cents to get it going. So, but okay, I'm with you that I think if we can deliver with paper cards, and I don't know if you got to see the first part of this hour, but yeah, PathCheck, along with many of the partners, have built an end-to-end system that's purely paper-based.
I had heard about that.
Yeah, it's digitally certified, and there's a lightweight app that's already out there that can be used either by healthcare professionals or at vaccination sites or caregivers after the fact to take them through. So I'm totally with you on paper. In fact, WHO just last week also requested a paper-first approach for improving vaccination workflows, really? As well as so-called health passports.
Yeah, I think that's smart. I think I like paper first. I've thought about these complex things where we're uploading the data from our system to some credentialing system and all of that. But what if you had a paper card, which you could show most places, that's fine. And then if you really want it digital, you take a photo of that, and there's some like sort of authentication structures and maybe built into a QR code or something. And so you analyze that card, and that all sort of travels into the digital domain where needed. I think something like that probably makes more sense. I have heard the idea that we could perhaps, by the way, use antibody testing with an antibody test that's looking at the spike receptor, the RBD or whatever, so that you could actually kind of recapture who has vaccination coverage later. In other words, even if they were given a vaccine door to door and there was no paperwork, you might have a way that they could kind of separately ask to be credentialed as having had it. So you would then conceivably, in a really radical system, just not, just deliver vaccines. Just go and stick people. And I mentioned tattoos sort of jokingly, but is there some equivalent of the hand stamp that you get at the club to get you, in, that could last a little longer? Maybe it's it's a temporary tattoo that lasts a year or something, so that I know in India, Dr. Gawande writes in his book Better about when they were doing I think it was polio vaccines, and they had a way of knowing, it was like a mark on the door of the house or something, whether they'd been to that house before. And maybe it's something like that, which is super low tech, not digital at all, that kind of gets you kind of where you need to go in terms of getting everybody vaccinated.
All we need is a QR code tattoo, so that you can scan the QR code, scan the tattoo as a QR code.
I think people would get a little nervous about that, the people who think there are chips in the vaccines, but seriously, what if we didn't capture any data at all? What if we just say, if you want proof, you go, wait a certain amount of time and then go get an antibody test, and then you can have the proof that you got this. And there's probably 5% of the people who care about that, and most people don't.
Yeah. So let's talk about proof for a minute, right? I mean, so as you know, there's a lot of noise about verifiable credentials and health passports, and some organizations are proposing very complex systems where there's some kind of a rule engine that runs in the web and will charge you 50 cents every time somebody.
This, right? We all thought about this, 6, 8, 10 months ago for testing, and there was, as far as I could tell, there was absolutely no adoption beyond controlled environments like in a IHE. Do I have that right, Professor Feldman?
ITA,
yeah. In the universities, I got my test, I got my cleared, thing, and that allows me to eat at the cafeteria. Like, that stuff happened. But in terms of broadly adopted solutions in society, I don't know, Singapore probably has something, but I haven't seen anything yet. So that led me to have more skepticism. Early on, I was a big fan of those concepts. And what I'm wondering is the world really asking for some tightly managed system like this? We have talked with sports stadiums about their reopening plans. We're supporting that work in a number of locations. And one of the questions is, well, would you have a section which is just open to people who have been vaccinated? They did that at the Super Bowl. Like, this is not a completely outlandish idea. They actually already did it. Well, it actually works, by the way, if everyone in that section has had a vaccine, because none of them can get it, even if some people are carriers. You do have to keep those separate from anyone who's, let's say, tested and let in, because those people won't necessarily have any immunity or resistance to the virus, and you can't mix those two groups. But which becomes complicated if you're talking about families where some people have vaccines and some people don't, and all that. But if we get to the point where there's a lot of vaccines out there, you could imagine that some places, restaurants, stadiums, what have you, might just be open for people who have vaccines, or certain sections would be. And then the question is, well, do you go to some sort of high-tech system, or do you just have your dog-eared paper vaccine card that you got at the vac site? And I think it's going to be the latter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's why the first half we spent talking about a paper credential that looks like this, right? Yeah. And that has all the QR codes on the other side. That you can walk in and walk out, and it's digitally certified, so you don't have to. It can be verified with an offline app without access to the internet. So
I'm loving that. I think the simple reality is the only place that a push from like that could come from that will work is from your national governments. I think even the state level governments, they're just not going to introduce a system like that, because it doesn't help that much for Massachusetts to have one that doesn't work when you go to another state or people come from another state. And so And so I think you're going to see some governments actually get their act together. And I mean, my money's on Singapore doing something like that, but I just don't see it happening that much. I mean, I suspect China might do something. But the rest of us, people are worried about identity, national identity cards. All these things are very concerning for people. I just don't see it getting traction in this country.
I mean, in countries like, Scandinavian or Israel, or you mentioned Singapore, these are national health systems. It's very easy for them to just send an SMS or even a saying, this is a certificate that's digitally certified. Vaccination, you're done.
In a handful of very organized countries that are not concerned about the data issues, yes.
Yeah. It's pretty
If I can, I'd like to comment on Singapore for a moment because my son lives in Singapore, and so I can tell you how they are doing it there. They do have a national system that is pushed out on your cell phone, and it is true tracking. So they truly do track you and follow you. And as an example, if you're in an establishment like a store for greater than 15 minutes and you have not shown your passport, you get a little ding on your phone. And so, but as Ramesh mentioned, it's a completely different kind of government. They can do that. They monitor you in your homes and things like that. Consequently, they've had very few cases, and the cases that they have had have not been nationals or expats, but they have
migrant workers, as I recall, was the area they had the most issues.
That's right. That's where I was going. Yeah, exactly. So I just like to, since I have some firsthand knowledge on that, I figured I would offer that.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I look, I think there are different possibilities available to different countries based on their heritage and culture and political and norms. I lived in Singapore for 6 months. It was a great experience. And I think we saw Korea did a really great job, for instance, with contact tracing early on in a way that we weren't sort of politically there to really implement the contact tracing that was possible through Apple and Google in a way that actually really worked. So I think each country just needs to work with the resources it's got within the boundaries it has. The U.S. has seen a much worse impact of coronavirus than nearly everywhere else. And that's a product of who we are, right? And perhaps a product of not having stronger central leadership that led us to be someone other than who we were.
Yeah, I mean, Europeans are suffering in the same way. So I think it's also a cultural issue. We're coming at the top of the hour, but Tim, let's talk at least for a few minutes about the app. I know both you and I agree that apps are apps, but like paper would be great. But let's pick your brain, and from where you sit, like what would be some of the things that you would like to see? Like, Delta Airlines or JetBlue has their apps that improves their, workflows at the airports, for example, or allows them to stay in touch with folks, give them alerts that if the flights are delayed, or allows them to, have kind of a post-flight experience and so on.
Saying using those as an analogy, what is the analogy in the COVID space, or
for a user journey? If there's an app, what should the app have other than the standard things like reminders and scheduling and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I do think what I would want as a more technologically oriented person is to be able to have a trustable credential that I could use that gets me benefits, like being able to be, in a restaurant in a maskless area or something like that. I was presuming I had a vaccine, which I don't yet, but at such point as I do, I could imagine that would be helpful. I think, from a workplace standpoint, more and more employers are going to say, well, look, you can work for us, whether at home or at work, but if you want to come into the office, you need to have a vaccine. And unless there's some special circumstance, a note from your doctor, whatever, that's fine. But, barring special circumstances, you should have a vaccine. And so I think employers will probably, want some simple way of being able to confirm that and so forth. Yeah. But looking at the testing experience, there just wasn't a super amount of appetite in the United States for sort of rigorously structuring that.
Yeah.
I-
But one could argue that testing, other than your effort, didn't really scale. I know it's still a mess, but vaccines is kind of a one-time thing, and hundreds of millions are going to get it. I don't know what the fraction of US population that ever got tested. I'm guessing that's less than 10% of the US population that ever got tested.
Right. But the sky doesn't fall if you have one person who was not vaccinated who slips in. In fact,
That's
it's greatest for them. So as an employer, what I imagine saying is, hey, at a certain point when there's enough access to vaccines that this is a reasonable thing to say, hey, if you want to be coming to the office, you have to have a vaccine. I actually don't feel the need to enforce that with some special app. I'm just going to say that, and then somebody's going to tell me if somebody didn't really have the vaccine, was coming into work or whatever. That is until there's some sort of highly publicized problem or outbreak or something, and people think, gee, we got to invest more in controlling this. But I don't even foresee that. I think if you have a 95% compliance, you're well into herd immunity land, and so you're really not going to have an issue in the office.
Yeah.
And so, I think
but we're also expecting it to be more like a common flu, and you might have to take a shot every year, every 18 months, something like that. So,
Yep.
so we don't know how it'll roll out. But in our analysis, we do agree that in places where who you're going to interface in advance, like employers or even stadiums, it's not very interesting because you can just attach that to your employee badge or your ticket.
Right.
It's also not interested when people are going to be social distanced anyway. But the middle, where shopping malls or restaurants or lobbies, where there's an intermittent and unknown exchange.
I think there are certain venues like dating apps where there might be a lot of interest in like really ascertaining this, lower trust, higher stakes. I think, I could imagine the major dating app companies wanting to have a way, they have a way where you can upload your face and like do something with your fingers to show you are who you are. Maybe they send you an antibody test and it's like a verified, this person has antibodies. I think there are going to be a few niches, certainly international travel may end up working like that. Certain government jobs, so that's another area you could look at, is a solution for the niches where this matters instead of trying to be a solution for everyone.
Yeah.
Listen, I've got a meeting at the top of the hour, so I do need to run. But
Thank you all for joining. I want to thank all our participants, and thank you, Tim. We do hope that you'll make some of your know-hows and especially data sets available for innovators to look through, and you'll continue to share with us.
Will in some way. We just haven't had a chance literally to think as we've been working so hard to build these places.
Excellent. So we're going to stop the recording. But if the speakers want to stay on for a few minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Good.